Good afternoon or good morning to folks that are out on the West Coast, and good evening to those that are joining us from Europe today. This is Scott Dill with Real Story Group for today's weekly webinar series about an omni-channel stack for CPGs. We're very excited. We've had a lot of conversations with our subscribers, and this is something that is really near and dear to our heart. So we're looking forward to presenting this fast-paced webinar today. My colleague Jared Jingers, our managing director and one of our principal analysts, will be taking you through the heart of today's presentation. But as we get started, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on Real Story Group, as I do see a number of new folks on the line with us today. So fundamentally, we are a research firm, and we have three different subscription offerings that are available to you. The first is what we've traditionally offered for the last decade plus is our vendor selection advisory, where you can subscribe to one research area or multiple technology marketplaces, and you can either take a self-service type of approach or add on some advisory hours with Jared and the rest of our analyst team. So that is one option for you. And then a couple of more recent additions to our package offerings are our stack advisory and council level membership subscriptions. In these instances, what we do is actually provide you with access to all of our research, along with a set number of advisory hours throughout the year, and taking more of a holistic look at your stack, where you have some redundancies or what are some potential gaps. And we look at some different vendors that are out there that could potentially meet your needs. We've also had the good fortune of launching our Omnichannel Stack Executive Council, which launched last year. We've had two meetings already, which were both in person and highly productive, with a number of different MarTech stack leaders from organizations of all shapes and sizes. But it's interesting how we have such a great cross-section of verticals represented as part of that council, and we will be meeting again in June, early June. This one will be online, but the goal is to get back to in-person meetings as quickly as we can. So certainly, if you'd like more information about that June 4th meeting, please let us know. We'll be happy to provide you with further details. Two key differentiators with Real Story Group as opposed to other analyst firms you may be familiar with. First and foremost is the fact that we never work for or advise the vendors we cover in any way. So we don't speak at their conferences or write white papers for them or advise them on their strategy. That way we can provide you as a technology user and buyer the real story behind what the vendors do well, but sometimes more importantly, what they don't do so well and where they could fall short for you. Now, in terms of our coverage areas, we are completely focused on the MarTech or omni-channel technology space. So you look, we got our start in web content management almost 20 years ago now, added DAM about 10 to 12 years ago, and since have added some of these other areas as well, such as marketing automation, customer data platforms, journey orchestration engines, etc. Those are all available for, you can download samples from the research right from our website. And then you'll see here a snapshot of the different vendors that we cover in these spaces. And so one other thing to think about when you're looking at Real Story Group, and if you're comparing us to other analyst firms that are out there, we provide you with more choices. Because we're solely focused on the omni-channel technology space, we're able to actually cover more vendors in those areas. So not just those platform vendors that you see in the middle of this map, but rather some of the other best in breed solutions that are out on the periphery of the map. So certainly something to keep in mind if you are looking for some assistance from a research perspective. With that, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague and our managing director, Jared Jingers, for the heart of today's presentation. Jared?
Hey, Scott, thank you so much. And thank you for all of you who are taking some time out of your schedules to visit with us today. I really appreciate it. I know if you're anything like me, you feel like we should have more time than ever on our hands, but in some ways I feel like we're busier than ever. And so I appreciate any time that you want to spend with us. So today we're going to be talking about CPGs, and we're going to be talking about in particular a reference model for CPGs that we think that you should, if you're in that CPG world, it's a reference model that we think you can get some value out of. Scott mentioned that we have had the pleasure over the close to 20 years that we've been around to work with customers of all shapes and sizes. But I was doing some fact checking this morning, and I looked up, and I think over the last 19 or so years, we've had the opportunity to work with dozens of the top 100 CPG firms that are out there, and in fact, we've had pretty close relationships with 4 out of the top 5. So we've learned a lot from you all, and a lot of what we've seen working and not working from many of you is what has really influenced this reference model that I'm going to show you today. So here's the plan. We'll first talk about why CPGs are different. Second, we'll get into talking about reference models in general and how we got here, and why we think the reference model for the 2020s needs to be different than in the past. And then we'll talk about what that means when we look at it from specifically a CPG flavor to it. So that's the plan for today. All right. So why is CPG different? So I know many of you work in the space. Some of you are just might be new to the space. I know we have a bunch of consultants and other folks on the line who are looking to advise your clients in the space. So let's all get on the same page here. The fact of the matter, when we look at the CPG industry, or the consumer product goods industry, there's a lot of similarities to other industries that we work with, without a doubt. But there's some real key differences. And many of those differences are due to some of the things that I wanted to point out here. Number one is CPGs are inherently product-centric, right? And so everything that you do is through the lens of a product or a product family or a brand or a group of brands. And with that product centricity, your everything that you do when it comes to creating experiences are also tied back to products. And that's not the case in every industry. And because of that, your technology needs to be able to support that way of thinking and that way of creating experiences. Another key difference is the seasonality that comes along with consumer product goods. Now, this isn't true in every single case, but in many cases, there are different products that are more relevant to different times of the year, and you need to have different messages that are timely and get to the right person at the right time. There's certainly a notion of scalability that is at a different level than many other industries when it comes to the CPG world. Things like Black Friday or the holiday rush, or even things like Fashion Week, create spikes within the CPG world that your systems need to be able to support. I think the notion of the importance of partners in this space, or third parties, is really an important one that I'll get into a little bit later. But it's a notion of how much can you control when it comes to your experiences. And in many cases we can control a lot of things, but in a lot of other cases we need to give up some control, and that's scary, but it's the reality of the CPG world. I think it's easy to think about giving up control to third parties and whatnot, but there's also been a pretty significant trend in the last decade or so for CPG companies to provide their products direct to consumers as well. So the lines between CPG and retail are officially been blurred, and there's a lot of overlap there, and that model creates some more complexity that you need to be able to support in your stacks. Certainly, we'll frame this conversation in a largely digital basis, but many of you know, in the CPG world, it's not just digital. Printed catalogs, in-store signs, physical displays are still extremely important when we talk about creating experiences. And another physical aspect is packaging. The packages that your products are delivered within are key content types that need to be accurate. They need to be on brand and create a unique challenge for you to consider as you create experiences. So these are just some. It's certainly not a complete perfect list, but it's some things to think about as we think about why this is different. So next, let's talk about reference models. Scott mentioned we've been around since 2001, and as a research and analyst firm, one of the things that we do for our clients all the time is create reference models for you to kind of challenge you as to how you're doing business and think about how your situation stacks up with what some others are doing. Now, reference models are not meant to be perfect. They're meant to be models for you to kind of consider and see where you might have missing pieces or redundancies or maybe just a different way of doing things for you to consider. And so we like to break up the evolution of our current reference models when it comes to our omnichannel stack in three big pieces as we sit here today. And these big pieces really align with the last few decades. So if we look at the early 2000s when we were first setting out on this journey, we might have been talking about omnichannel, some of us, but in reality, what we were doing is more of a multi-channel publishing type experience, where many of us were certainly thinking about how can we optimize our web presence, but mobile was starting to come, and syndication through different other channels were happening, and a lot of this was happening through content management systems, and in particular web content management systems as some of our early publishing tools. And everyone had this goal of creating consistent experiences there, but the purview of our scope of influence here was pretty limited. Certainly not at the omnichannel level that we see today. Moving forward to the 2010s, I think what we saw there was more channels emerging, certainly with social and email being really important amongst those. But I think the big trend that happened in the 2010s was this notion of horizontal integration. So if you look at that colorful tier towards the middle and bottom here, we call it our content and engagement management tier. The important thing to pay attention to here is these emergence of these arrows or integrations between our systems of engagement. So all of a sudden, we put a lot of effort into integrating between our digital asset management systems and moving assets into our web content management system, and having our web content management system talk to our marketing automation systems and social publishing tools. And so we started to say, if we're going to do multi-channel, and if we're on our way to truly achieving omni-channel, we need to at least start to pass these assets and content between these systems so we're not completely siloed. So novel approach, and many of us are still on that journey today, and some of us are further along that journey than others. But I think that model of the 2010s was on the right track, but not quite near where we need to go when we think of truly omni-channel, ideal customer engagement at every single touch point. And so we wanted to challenge that stack in the way it was going as we started to approach the 2020s. And so some of the questions that we asked is what makes up the ideal customer engagement if we're talking about true omni-channel experiences at every single customer or constituent touch point. And what we boil it down to is that there are some fundamental building blocks to experiences, and for the sake of this conversation, I like to boil it down to 5 main building blocks: content, data, rules, planning, and analytics. So the goal, when we think about what's that ideal engagement at an omni-channel level, it's to get the right content and the right message to the right person in the right context at the right time, and then measure the effectiveness of it. When we talk about omni-channel, that's what we're trying to do. And so for the 2020s, we created this reference model. Now, I know this is a lot to look at, and I don't need you to digest it all. We're going to go through each of these bands in a few moments, but in general, we're talking about engagement channels at the top, interaction and delivery environments, content and engagement management platforms, and then this new layer of what we're calling enterprise foundation platforms. And we'll get to that in just a few minutes. But when we were working with our CPG clients and introduced this reference model, and again, this reference model is not meant to be perfect, the feedback we got from the CPG folks is, well, something's missing. And I think what was really missing there is this primarily the notion of where does product information fit in. And so we need to account for that, certainly. But also, when it comes to content, we need to think about packaging information, and we need to think about, when it comes to product information, we need to think about nutritional information and size variants or different ingredients and gluten freeness and all these other different variables that needed to be accurate if we're going to create optimal experiences. So there's an extra layer of consideration, an extra building block, if you will, to creating omni-channel experiences in the CPG world. And so that led us to an adapted model for the CPG space, and it's similar to the model I showed earlier. But if you look at the colored boxes, I think there's some key technologies that need to be considered. One being product information aggregation. 2, product information management and packaging workflows. We'll get into, let's dive into each of these layers to think about how these layers need to be thought of differently for CPG companies, and you'll see the impact that these differences have on your stack in general. So if we start at the top of our technology layer cake, if you will, we look at the engagement channels and your interaction and delivery environments. Now, if we going back in time, our goals haven't changed all that much. Our goal is still consistent and accurate engagement at every single touch point. But while historically we've focused on advertising and face-to-face type of engagements in the CPG world, today we still are concerned about advertising and face-to-face, but the digital shelf has emerged as like a major consideration of every single CPG firm. And I like this definition. It's not perfect, but it's a simple definition from Salsify. The digital shelf is your third-party e-commerce sites, your mobile apps, your product pages, and in other words, wherever your products are displayed. Now, it's all well and good to think about that, but it's such a challenge to think about. Not only are you talking about your own e-commerce platforms, but there are so many third parties out there who want to consume your content, to consume your experiences, to consume your products so that they can sell those in a retail environment. This is everything from Amazons and Walmarts and Targets of the world down to the smaller supermarkets like the Krogers and Stop and Shops and Shaw's, to hundreds, if not thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of smaller retailers who want to sell your products as well. So the problem is getting more challenging, and there's more touch points, and there's that notion of, sure, you can control things within your environments, but once those products and content and messages and data gets outside your environment, how do you ensure that consistency? And there's no perfect answer, but there's a better way to think about this. So next, I want to move to the middle of the layer cake and talk about your content engagement management platforms. So for many of you, this is where majority of the folks creating experiences do most of their work. If you think about, for many of you, people in your service and support centers and people in your call centers and your sales force, these are folks on the front lines of talking to many of your customers or partners. Some key questions in the CPG space is, should your service and support systems be the same as your sales systems? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. But more important question I think that people should be looking at here is, do you have technology that is product centric enough to handle the CPG world? You know, I've seen a lot of pain experienced here for people trying to shoehorn CRM systems that were fundamentally people focused and tried to get them to serve as an end-all be-all repository for everything product focused. You know, and you think about things like what happens when someone calls about a particular product and complains about a product. How do you make sure that loop is closed back to the product family, and that's stored at both the customer level, but also the product level. And you know, that fundamental notion of people-centric technology versus product-centric technology and how those things merge is a tough one to figure out, but you got to have the right system to do the job there. You know, some of the traditional content and engagement platforms that we talk about that you're undoubtedly all familiar with, you know, social publishing tools and engagement tools, you know, email and marketing automation tools and web publishing tools. You know, you have the same challenges as other industries do, certainly, but on top of that, because of the product centricity, you know, you might have multiple social accounts. You know, you have your corporate social account and your enterprise account, and then you might have brand accounts, you might have specific product accounts, and you start to think about, okay, well, does each of those have their own content, their own tone and voice? Probably there's a lot of uniqueness that happens there, but what about shared content? Is there content that can be or needs to be shared across these product families or products in general? And you know, how does that sharing happen? How does that sharing happen among the accounts, but also how does that sharing happen among these different systems? And what are the rules that you can create when people interact with you in these multiple channels? You know, do you want to create rules for someone who saw information about a product on your website, but then also clicked on something in an email, but you know they also interacted with a Twitter post and possibly liked a Twitter post? Do you want to create a different experience for that person versus someone else? Maybe, probably, but these are all things that you need to start thinking about, but you introduce the product centricity to this, and this problem gets harder and harder. Likewise, when we talk about aggregating content to third parties, you're now at the mercy of many of these third parties. And I know this is a huge pain point for many of you, whereas, you know, the Amazons and the Walmarts and the Targets of the world and many others, they're dictating how they want you to deliver assets and data and particularly product information to them. And you have to adhere to their templates. And now all of a sudden you have lots of templates from lots of different partners and that you need to conform to. And that's a huge challenge that many people encounter. Let's remember the ideal engagement. We want to get the right content and message and the right product information to the right people at the right time. One of the dangers and trappings that we're seeing people encounter, and this is happening more and more, is that too many of these basic building blocks are living within that middle tier. They're living within those systems of engagement. So for example, there's too much content, too much product information, too much data, customer data, too many of those engagement rules living within, for example, your web content management system. And likewise, some of these same building blocks are living within your marketing automation systems or your social publishing tools or in your CRM systems for your salespeople. And that's what happens is you're creating silos of these building blocks, and it's very difficult to create a consistent experience across the board at different touch points. So we've got to break these silos down, and that's why I wanted to introduce this notion of this enterprise foundation layer. Right? I want you to start to think about systems that are lower in your stack, that give the people who are working in that middle tier in those systems of engagement a set of building blocks to pull from and create experiences, but they're pulling from a set of content and data and rules that are truly omni-channel ready. And so I want to introduce several different types of technologies here. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the notion of product information management systems to be the single source of truth for your product information. I want you to think about customer data platforms as your definitive customer data and segment systems. And I also want you to think of an omni-channel content platform as a place for you to store your truly omni-channel ready assets and content snippets and possibly even micro experiences that can be delivered across any different channel. And so these are the systems that should feed the tools where your experience creators are working, as well as you're pulling from a set of rules that you've defined in your journey orchestration engine. You know, these are things that are independent of the channel, but you're creating rules to say that what happens in those channels is dictated by these rules. And so if you start to think about your stacks in a way that is based on this solid foundation, I think you're going to have a lot more flexibility in creating experiences that are consistent, that are on brand, that are speaking to the right person at the right time at every single touch point. And so the idea here is to move these building blocks, again, lower in your stack, and there's some benefits to this. You know, you might be able to think about your systems of engagement a little bit differently. Maybe you don't need as heavyweight of a web content management system, or as heavyweight as a marketing automation tool, or as heavyweight as a Salesforce automation tool. Maybe you can thin those layers out a little bit, and because you know that you're pulling from these definitive building blocks. And so this is again a reference model. It's not meant to be perfect, but it's meant to be challenging the traditional way of thinking here. And I wanted to leave you with a couple key points. Number one is the organizations, especially the CPG organizations that are most successful in creating this omni-channel experiences that we all desire, are the ones who are going to break those silos at that content and engagement management layer. So move those building blocks lower in your stacks. Number one. I also wanted to point out that not one vendor is going to solve all of this for you. Now, that might seem obvious to you, but we hear from vendors all the time and customers who are telling us that the vendors are telling them that they can be your single vendor for this. And in fact, we've seen a lot of vendors try to get in through one of these channels, but then really put the full court press on you to expand and expand and expand so that they gain a share of your stack over time. And unfortunately, their methods aren't always so nice. So something to think about. I want you to challenge the vendors at every step of the way here and make sure that they're the right fit for you. Don't just take their word for it. But we've seen the most successful organizations really think about finding the right technology in each of these spaces for the job, as opposed to thinking that it's a one-size-fits-all aspect. I think there are potential areas of consolidation. For example, there are opportunities for you to use a product information management system that also does product information aggregation. Not every case, I would say that's a plausible solution, but for some it might be. Okay, something to consider. Likewise, when we talk about an omni-channel content platform, there's a lot of overlap between those systems and digital asset management systems as you know them today. In many cases, I know some of you are using digital asset management systems in a way that you've evolved to starting to transition them into truly omni-channel content platforms, and that's something interesting as well. So there is opportunity to consolidate, but you're not going to get this from a single vendor. That's one certainty. So with that, we're just about out of time. I hope this reference model helps, and I hope it challenges you a little bit to think a little bit differently. We don't have a ton of time for questions today, but if you do have questions for me and you want to reach out to me directly, I'm happy to carry on the conversation, here's my email. Feel free to link into me on LinkedIn, or feel free to download a sample of any of our research if you want a sense of some of the findings that we're seeing with these different vendors and the strengths and weaknesses. And you'll see that we don't pull any punches when we talk about these vendors. We'll tell you like it is, and we'll give you with our goal of giving you the real story. So with that, let's wrap up and say thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to having the conversation with all of you in the future. Thank you.